Your feeling of helplessness is your best friend, Savage.
Beatrice!
Strap one on, it's time to jam, bitches. Let's all celebrate, and ESR Keating's back with part 2.
Yay.
That was a bit unexpected. Anyway, last time we counted, we were on 10 errors, and now that I think about it, the way that she's been releasing videos, if all of these are free videos, and she takes this long to do it, this video series is going to take 9 years to make. And think about it, she doesn't have a job. She's doing this full time now. This shouldn't be taking this long. Unless she's going on CNN again and complaining about how people don't like her on the internet.
Welcome to the second episode in our multi-part series exploring the roles and representations of women in video games.
Good God, it's been 3 months and you haven't changed that god-awful shirt. It must smell worse than the Master Chief's Mjolnir armor.
This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
Your perspective on this subject is so small and narrow-minded that even the smallest insect thinks that it's small.
Over the course of this series, I will be offering critical analysis of many popular games and characters, but please keep in mind that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy a piece of media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects. I just want to caution viewers that as we delve into more modern games, we will be discussing examples that employ some particularly gruesome and graphic depictions of violence against women. I'll do my best to only show what is necessary, but this episode does come with a trigger warning. It's also recommended that parents preview the video first before sharing with younger children.
I thought the only 3 people watching this video were people commentating on this, like me and a couple other people I can think of. The media critics that say everybody who disagrees with you is some kind of sexist pig. And 3 are your bum kissers who gave you so much money and are now defending you from every single little moment.
In our previous episode, we explored the history of the damsel in distress and how the trope became so pervasive in classic-era games from the 80s and early 90s. We also explored some of the core reasons why damsel characters are so problematic as representations of women.
They're not representing all women, only a small portion of women. You just don't like it because they're not catering to your exact desires when it comes to this sort of thing. And if I've repeated this many times, why don't you go and build your own video game characters? You claim to be so intelligent about this sort of thing.
So if you haven't seen it yet, please check that one out before continuing to watch this one. As a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device in which a female character is placed in a perilous situation from which she cannot escape on her own and then must be rescued by a male character, usually providing an incentive or motivation for the protagonist's quest. Now, it might be tempting to think that the damsel in distress was just a product of its time, and that by now surely the trope must be a thing of the past. Well, while we have seen a moderate increase in the number of playable female characters,
You've always had playable characters ranging from Miss Pac-Man to Phantasy Star, which had a lead female character. Final Fantasy series has always had female characters in it. I'm going to spare you a long list, but I've also been playing for the last couple of hours Hyper Dragoon Dimensions, which has an all-female cast. You'd probably complain about the fact that they're being slightly sexualized, and your point, and that's a problem because
the plot device hasn't gone away. In fact, the damsel in distress has seen a bit of a resurgence in recent years.
I have no idea why she's referencing Sonic 06. That game sucked harder than a Vietnamese prostitute.
Silence!
You've got to get me out of here.
In fact, what's the problem with Kingdom Hearts? Sora there gets her own Keyblade and becomes kick-ass later on in the series.
Get out.
He's hurting me.
Splatterhouse was awesome. You know, you had heavy metal, gore, a kick-ass soundtrack, and I loved every second of it, bitches.
Alice?
And I have no fucking idea why she's referencing Child of Eden. Because that isn't a game, that's an acid trip with a kick-ass soundtrack.
Bullet in her head.
What a dear little bird you are.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Suffice it to say, the trope is alive and well even today. And since the majority of these titles still focus on delivering crude, unsophisticated male power fantasies,
In your opinion, what's crude and unsophisticated could be uplifting and enlightening to other people. But anyway, aren't games always about fantasies? Because heck, I'm probably not going to have a chance to even look at half the cars that I've played in the Gran Turismo series. I'm very doubtful I'll ever fly a plane or save anybody, or be given an opportunity to save anybody's life or fight in a war. But anyway, that's getting a bit off topic.
developers are largely unwilling to give up the damsel in distress as an easy default motivation for their brooding male heroes or anti-heroes. Remember that as a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device used by writers, and not necessarily always just a one-dimensional character type entirely defined by victimhood.
Now that is irony.
You can hardly talk. You're defining yourself purely by your victimhood by going on CNN and complaining about how people don't like you because of this goddamn fucking product. And you should feel deeply ashamed of yourself. You're wasting time, money, and making yourself look like an even bigger idiot than I already thought you were.
Now and then, damsel characters may be well-written, funny, dynamic, or likable.
I'm just trying to set you on fire through this stupid hat!
What a delightfully mean little brain you have.
However, this extra character development tends to make their eventual disempowerment all the more frustrating. Damsels on the more sassy end of the spectrum may struggle with their captors, or even attempt an escape on their own, but inevitably their efforts always prove futile. Occasionally they may be allowed to offer the hero a last-minute helping hand, or to kick the bad guy while he's down, but these moments are largely symbolic and typically only happen after the core adventure is over, or the danger has passed.
Now, it's good to know that you've watched Thunderfoot's video, and that just comes across as a slightly halfway response to your critics.
These token gestures of pseudo-empowerment don't really offer any meaningful change to the core of the trope, and it feels like developers just throw these moments in the last minute to try and excuse their continued reliance on the damsel in distress.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
Periodically, game developers may attempt to build a more fleshed-out relationship or emotional bond between the damsel character and the male protagonist.
Oh no, video games are trying to get me emotionally invested in what's going on screen. How is that a goddamn fucking problem? Your problem with that being is they're not catering to your exact political ideology. Well, I'm sorry, video games aren't here to just service you. If you want to make a difference, I don't know, go and produce your own video game characters. You have enough money to, because this video series doesn't look like it costs that much.
In the most decidedly patronizing examples, depictions of female vulnerability are used as an easy way for writers to trigger an emotional reaction in male players.
Fuck you! You're the patronizing one. You constantly condescend to people. You constantly talk down to them. You kind of insult everybody's intelligence just because they're not catering to you exactly. Guess what? People don't have to live on your terms. They can live on their own goddamn terms and decide what's happiness for them. Not for you!
As we discussed in our first episode, when female characters are damseled, their ostensible agency is removed and they're reduced to a state of victimhood.
My biggest problem with this statement is that she's neglecting the fact that white people help each other. It's not because they're patronizing to it, it's not because they're sexist, it's not because they're misogynistic, it's because they generally might want to help the person in peril. Your biggest problem is that you're reading the worst into this. I try to look for the best in everything.
So narratives that frame intimacy, love, or romance as something that blossoms from or hinges upon the disempowerment and victimization of women are extremely troubling because they tend to reinforce the widespread regressive notion that women in vulnerable, passive, or subordinate positions are somehow desirable because of their powerlessness.
I don't know what she's talking about, but Aiko does not have a love interest. Aiko is about, what, 10, give or take? Or was it 8, I think? But anyway, there's no implied love interest apart from you two holding hands, which I think is actually kind of subtly sweet. As for the other game, I have no idea, but I haven't played it.
Unfortunately, these types of stories also help to perpetuate the paternalistic belief that power imbalances within romantic relationships are appealing, expected, or normal.
You can take the notion of normality when it comes to relationships and shove it up your ass. Normal relationships aren't a result of the society, or the music industry, or the game industry, or the film industry. Relationships should be between two individuals. So, admittedly, I have no idea what she's talking about as for power balances in relationships. It's like I previously mentioned, it's between the couple in the relationship.
Okay, so we know that the damsel in distress is alive and well in gaming, but that's not the full picture. There's an even more insidious side to the story. Over the past decade, game companies have been desperately searching for ways to stand out in a market increasingly oversaturated with very similar products. As a consequence, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of games attempting to cut through the clutter by being as dark and edgy as possible. So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
You know, I've already been over the woman in the refrigerators before with Anita Sarkeesian on a women in the, I think it's stuffed in the fridge video. So I recommend you watch it to know my true opinion on that trope.
The term women in refrigerators was coined in the late 1990s by comic book writer Gail Simone to describe the trend of female comic book characters who are routinely brutalized or killed off as a plot device designed to move the male character's story arc forward. The trope name comes from Green Lantern issue number 54, in which the superhero returns home to find his girlfriend murdered and stuffed inside his refrigerator. This trading of female characters' lives for something meant to resemble male character development is of course part of a long media tradition, but the gruesome death of women for shock value is especially prevalent in modern gaming. The women in refrigerator trope is used as the cornerstone of some of the most famous contemporary video games. It provides the core motivational hook behind both the Max Payne and the God of War series, for example.
My wife, my child.
In each case, the protagonist's wife and daughter are brutally murdered, and their deaths are then used by the developers as a pretext for their inevitable bloody revenge quest. It's interesting to note that the reverse scenario, games hinging on a woman vowing revenge for her murdered boyfriend or husband, are practically non-existent. The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd. Which is one of the reasons why the scene from Disney's Wreck-It Ralph is so humorous.
I think that was also satirizing the whole revenge plot twist. Because I also do kind of find it funny that she actually keeps a minigun under her wedding dress. Why would you need a minigun at a wedding anyway?
I could do a very long video just exploring this one trope in gaming.
Ah, fuck off. That's gonna probably be my response to that video.
But today I want to look at how the woman in refrigerator is connected to the damsel in distress, and specifically the ways game developers have found to combine these two plot devices. One popular variation is to simply use both tropes in the same plotline, so as to have the male protagonist's wife stuffed in the fridge while his daughter is damseled. In Outlaws, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter.
Who did this?
They've taken Sarah.
In Kane and Lynch, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter.
Kane and Lynch sucks monkey balls.
Find them all before they find Jenny.
In Prototype 2, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter. In Inversion, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter.
Layla, where is she?
In Asura's Wrath, your wife is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue your daughter.
Save her.
In Dishonored, the Empress is brutally murdered and you then have to rescue her daughter, though it's heavily implied that she's your daughter too.
And let's not forget the fact that the Empress actually comes back later on in the game through magic and technology.
Find Emily. Protect her.
It's no coincidence that the Fridge plot device and the Damsel plot device work in much the same way. Both involve female characters who have been reduced to complete states of powerlessness by the narrative, one via kidnapping, the other via murder. The two plot devices used together then allow developers to exploit both the revenge motivation and the good old-fashioned save-the-girl motivation.
Here's a question for everybody. What's the correct response to this situation? If you had a game where you had somebody murdered, your wife murdered, and your daughter kidnapped, what would be the right response? Sitting at home, crying about it all, or going out there and doing something about it? Because I'll guarantee you, if you had a video game where you just sat at home crying, it would probably be the world's most unsuccessful video game since plumbers don't wear ties.
Take your damn clothes off!
Believe it or not, there is another more insidious version of this particular trope hybrid, which I call the damsel in the refrigerator. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can a fridged woman still be in distress? Since by definition, being fridged usually sort of requires being dead.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
Well, here's how it works. The damsel in the refrigerator occurs when the hero's sweetheart is brutally murdered, and her soul is then trapped or abducted by the villain. This oh-so-dark and edgy twist provides players with a double dose of female disempowerment and allows developers to again exploit both the revenge motivation and the saving the damsel motivation, but this time with the same woman at the same time. This trope combination can be traced back to old-school side-scrollers like Splatterhouse 2 and Ghouls and Ghosts, but the damsel in the refrigerator has definitely become a more popular trend in recent years. In Medieval 2, your murdered girlfriend's soul is stolen and you must fight to save her.
She's not your girlfriend at the time, and in fact that actually comes around about 3/4 of the way into the game and is then quickly dealt with. So I have no idea what she's talking about.
Good mercy, honorable knight. Spare me.
And another thing, how is Medieval 2 a modern game? Last time I checked, that game is close to 13 or 14 years old.
In The Darkness 2, your murdered girlfriend's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her.
Her soul is mine.
In Shadows of the Damned, your murdered girlfriend's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her.
She's not murdered, she's actually alive and well.
In Dante's Inferno, your murdered wife's soul is trapped in hell and you must fight to free her. In Castlevania Lords of Shadow, your wife's soul is trapped on Earth and you must fight to free her. The damsel in the refrigerator is part of a larger trend of throwing women under the bus in increasingly gruesome ways, in an apparent attempt to interject what I'll loosely refer to as mature themes.
It is a mature theme. What do you want it to do? Have no female deaths whatsoever? Have video games where it's like, I respect you. No, I respect you. No, I respect you. We have to all respect each other.
Developers must be hoping that by exploiting sensationalized images of brutalized women, it'll be enough to fool gamers into thinking that their games are becoming more emotionally sophisticated.
Yes, and as we all know, you're the big guardian of what's emotionally sophisticated. Like I said, all of her videos are opinion-based. She brings nothing to the table to back up what is or isn't mature in her opinion.
But the truth is, there's nothing mature about most of these stories, and many of them cross the line into blatant misogyny.
You use the word misogyny to describe everything that you don't like. This is misogyny. How is it misogyny? they're not hating women. All they're doing is trying to get people emotionally involved in the video games, and because most people have had loving relationships, it's something that they can easily exploit for emotional attachment.
Since what we're really talking about here are depictions of violence against women, it might be useful to quickly define what I mean by that term. When I say violence against women, I'm primarily referring to images of women being victimized, or when violence is linked specifically to a character's gender or sexuality.
That prototype clip was because she was infected by a virus, and that would have meant she would have been having a long, drawn-out, painful death. As for the whole violence against women, they're not technically even women, they are fictional game characters. This is one huge straw man for you.
Female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims. As I mentioned in our last video, the damsel in distress doesn't always have to be accompanied by a heroic rescue.
Here I was again, with all hell breaking loose around me, standing over another dead girl I had been trying to protect.
Sometimes the hero fails to save the woman in question, either because he arrives too late, or because, surprise twist, she's been dead the whole time.
Nicole has been dead this whole time.
What a twist!
No!
All my powers, and I couldn't do a thing.
Or in the case of the 2009 version of Bionic Commando, not only has your wife been dead the whole time, but turns out she's actually a part of your bionic arm.
I never want you to be involved in this.
It's okay. I'll always be by your side.
Yes, you heard that correctly. His wife is his arm. God.
You didn't just face pound then. You want to be taken seriously. You want this to be academia. I'm sorry, but that is immature of you. As the whole part of your woman being a part of your biotic arm, it's a bit, I will admit, it's a bit stupid.
But the most extreme and gruesome variant of this trend is when developers combine the damsel in distress with the mercy killing. This usually happens when the player character must murder the woman in peril for her own good. I like to call this happy little gem the euthanized damsel. Typically, the damsel has been mutilated or deformed in some way by the villain, and the only option left of the hero is to put her out of her misery himself.
Now, admittedly, this may sound kind of dark, but I'm for euthanasia because I would rather die somewhat in pain, somewhat with my faculties in check, rather than dying a very slow, very painful, and very pointless, drawn-out death. Unlike Ania Sarkeesian, who's going to make euthanasia sound like violence towards women, and somehow this is supposed to oppress all women everywhere. Which last time I checked, she doesn't speak for all women, nor does she know what every woman thinks of every situation.
We can trace this one back to the original 1980s arcade game Splatterhouse, in which your kidnapped girlfriend is possessed and the player is forced to fight and kill her.
And what, pray tell, is misogynistic or leading to the patriarchy or encouraging violence against women about having to fight a monster that was your girlfriend? And last time I checked, very rarely would your wife turn out to be a monster. Or would turn into a monster.
After saving his bitten beloved in Castlevania Lament of Innocence, the hero must then kill her to gain the power to defeat the Vampire Lord.
Thank you, Leon.
In Breath of Fire 4, Alina has been turned into a hideous monster and then begs you to kill her. In Gears of War 2, Dom is motivated to rescue his captured wife Maria. When he finds her, she has been starved and possibly tortured into a catatonic state, and so he shoots her. In Tenchu Shadow Assassins,
Do it. You must.
the princess meekly asks the hero to cut her down to get to the villain, which he does.
Look, all she's doing in these videos is just stating a problem, listing games that fall within that problem she's mentioning, and somehow that reinforces some magical patriarchy that all members of the patriarchy sit in a hollowed out volcano and twiddle their mustache and say, what's the best way of, oppressing women today, men? No! All she's complaining about is people using ideas or telling stories that she doesn't approve of. So guess what, Anita? You don't have to play any of these games. And furthermore, how is this encouraging violence against women everywhere? This isn't encouraging violence. Heck, even if there was a game out there that's strictly saying do violence against women, there's no guarantee that it would be a success, nor would it guarantee that people who play it get that message out of it.
A particularly egregious example can be found in Grand Theft Auto 3, when after you've rescued Maria Latour, it's implied that the protagonist suddenly shoots her because she's talking about stereotypically girly things.
When people do this, I don't really know what that means.
Note the word imply in this statement.
I broke a nail and my hair is ruined. I mean, can you believe it? This one cost me $50.
The writers deliberately wrote her character to annoy the player, so in the end, the violence against her becomes the punchline of a cheap misogynist joke.
Hey, how many feminists does it take to screw in a light bulb? 5! 1 to screw in the light bulb and the other 4 to make a support group. And anyway, I would like to point out even Rockstar themselves are very morally ambiguous about the ending of whether or not that she got shot. And furthermore, it's a cutscene, the player didn't do jack shit.
Sometimes these killings happen via cutscene, while other games ask the player to participate directly by pulling the trigger themselves. In the Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles remake, if you don't rescue Richter Belmont's beloved Annette, she will turn into a vampire and you'll then have to kill her.
Oh my god, Annette. I'm so sorry I didn't save you, but you know what I do to vampires. What I have to do.
No! I'll make you mine forever!
That's the whole point, the player can choose to save the Annette, or they can choose to, skip over it. They're giving the player the choice.
The captured women in Duke Nukem 3D beg you to kill them throughout the game. This misogynist scene is regurgitated and actually made worse in the 2011 follow-up, Duke Nukem Forever, developed by Gearbox.
Now, I only will admit that this was a bit on the morally disgusting side, only because of one thing. Duke Nukem's response, which was, oh my god, you're pretty fucked. Which was like, you idiot! You could have at least shown some humanity at that point.
Another popular Gearbox game, Borderlands 2, also uses this plot twist when Angel asks the player to murder her as a way to try and thwart the villain's evil plan.
Destroying the iridium injectors that keep me alive will stop the key from charging, and it will end a lifetime of servitude.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
The end of Alone in the Dark gives the player the choice between killing your girlfriend yourself,
Choose quickly, carrier. Kill her or let her live. You alone can decide.
or letting Satan kill her by being reborn in her body.
That's the thing, they're giving the player the choice. At the end of the day, you could even choose not to play the video game. I mean, heck, these are minor complaints.
The Wii game Pandora's Tower includes one ending in which Elena begs you to kill her before she completes her transformation into a monster.
Please. I beg of you.
the 2006 shooter Prey, when the hero finally reaches his abducted girlfriend, she's been hideously mutilated and fused with a monster, which you must fight while she screams for help over and over again.
Get away from me, Tommy! She wants me to kill you! I can't stop it!
After being incapacitated, she begs you to kill her.
Please, Tommy. Let me go.
And the player can't advance in the narrative until you shoot her in the face. These damseled women are written so as to subordinate themselves to men. They submissively accept their grisly fate and will often beg the player to perform violence on them, giving men direct and total control over whether they live or die, even saying thank you with their dying breath. In other words, these women are asking for it, quite literally.
From what I can understand, there are 6 different endings depending on what the player makes in Pandora's Temple. So this is a very minor complaint. So minor, in fact, that I don't know why she's making the complaint at all. So what? There's an ending where one of your beloved characters dies, or you have to kill her. You have to euthanize her. And plus, euthanasia is something that you may have to come across in real life. So it's good to have some context in a video game about something that we may or may not have to get through our eventually in our lives.
The euthanized damsel is the darkest and edgiest of these trope hybrids, but it's also an extension of a larger pattern in gaming narratives where male protagonists are forced to fight their own loved ones who have been possessed or brainwashed by villains. When Kratos finds his mother in the PSP game God of War Ghosts of Sparta, she morphs into a hideous beast, forcing you to fight and kill her.
And in Dante's Inferno, you have to fight your own dad.
Go on! Use me as an excuse! Blame me for everything!
You're so full of greed and hate. Is that all you had to offer me?
I'm not responsible for the man you are!
And I will not be damned like you.
An act for which she thanks you with her dying breath.
Finally, I am free.
After your girlfriend is transformed into a green ogre and grabbed by the ghoulies, she chases you around trying to get a kiss. Later, you must beat her unconscious before she can be returned to normal.
Okay, now you're just getting hugely desperate. How is just punching somebody to get them to stop attacking you a sign of misogyny or woman-hating or reinforcing some magical patriarchy?
The final boss in Shadows of the Damned turns out to be your own girlfriend.
Where is my freedom?
Who you must shoot down.
Now that is a big boner. All right, Johnson, let's take this pole for a stroll.
Similar scenarios are replicated in dozens of other titles as well.
Jill Valentine in Resident Evil 5 isn't a damsel in distress. At best she's being used by Albert Wesker against you, but she is not in distress. She is not being oppressed by anybody. She's just being used by Albert Wesker as a ploy to confuse Chris.
Although the narratives all differ slightly, the core element remains the same. In each case, violence is used to bring these women back to their senses. These stories conjure up supernatural situations in which domestic violence perpetrated by men against women who have lost control of themselves not only appears justified, but is presented as an altruistic act done for the woman's own good.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's depending on what game you're playing. Some games do have violence against women, which, according to you, we shouldn't have violence against women, which last time I checked, it's depending on the game. If the game is overtly violent, then you're going to have, and if women stand against you, you have to defeat them. There is nothing misogynistic about it. It's just either the game dictating what the rules are, or it's a moral choice that you're giving the player And I don't see anything wrong with, having to use violence against somebody who's willing to do violence against you.
Of course, if you look at any of these games in isolation, you'll be able to find incidental narrative circumstances that can be used to explain away the inclusion of violence against women as a plot device. But just because a particular event might make sense within the internal logic of a fictional narrative, that doesn't in and of itself justify its use.
Yeah, because as we all know, all video games have to be about respecting everybody's opinion. Look, Anita, sometimes video games may have violence. Some video games may not have violence, depending on the will of what video game you want to play at that point. I don't see how this is a big problem. You're making a molehill into a mountain.
Games don't exist in a vacuum, and therefore can't be divorced from the larger cultural context of the real world. It's especially troubling in light of the serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women facing the female population on this planet. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States.
Now, this is probably the most morally disgusting part of the video for me. She starts talking about domestic violence in this statistic, which I can't find backed up anywhere else. But I'm going to take this at face value, even though I have been unable to find anywhere to back it up. So, okay, I've just quickly run the numbers, and okay, so she may have a point at this precise moment, but that's even if the number that I've gotten is correct, because I've read on certain websites the domestic violence abuse for last year was only 1.3 million compared to the 300 million people who live in the US. But anyway, that's getting beside the point.
And on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day. Research consistently shows that people of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them.
Okay, now, she doesn't cite her sources or where she's getting this information from, so she could just be pulling out right out of her ass right now. So I have no reason to believe her, so I will dismiss this evidence as horseshit.
In the same vein, abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it.
And how the fuck is this related to video games? This is supposed to be about damsels in distress, not how domestic violence and causation and causality, and how you don't like how women are being treated all over the world. And in fact, if you follow this statistic, violence against women is actually being steadily on the decrease. Who knows why? Maybe video games are actually allowing people to get out minor frustrations. Maybe access to pornography. I know this is a causation versus causality, so essentially my argument is just as full of shit as Anita Sarkeesian, but I'll put it this way. Who are you going to believe? The person who isn't insulting you, or the person who is insulting you?
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
Even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women, nevertheless they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
That's rich coming from you. You're doing the exact same thing. You're exploiting victimization of women all over the world. And excuse me, how is complaining about video games going to decrease domestic violence? And before anybody asks, I honestly think domestic violence is morally disgusting to me, and people who try to capitalize on it are morally disgusting to me.
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy.
So what the fuck have you been complaining about for the last 20-odd minutes then? All you've been doing is saying this misrepresents women, therefore it's oppressing women, it's forcing women into stereotypes, it's degrading them, it's harming them. It's harming men, it's harming women, it's harming children, it's harming your next door neighbour, it's harming your dog, it's harming your monkey. Honestly, I would rather her stick to the point that she's been making for the last couple of minutes, than this limp-wristed, half-cocked excuse for it all.
Most probably just haven't given much thought to the underlying messages their games are sending.
Why should they? They're not here to stand for all of ill societies. They're here to make games, not to be moral arbiters. If you want them to be moral arbiters, just get out of their way and let them do their jobs then. I'm fairly certain if you get out of the way and let them do their job, they'll be able to do it better than if you got in their way while trying to complain about them doing their job.
And in many cases, developers have backed themselves into a corner with their own game mechanics. When violence is the primary gameplay mechanic, and therefore the primary way that the player engages with the game world, it severely limits the options for problem solving. The player is then forced to use violence to deal with almost all situations because it's the only meaningful mechanic available.
That's depending on the will of the game that you're playing. You could play simply go off and play nothing but point and click adventure games. You can play nothing but platformers. You can play nothing but really art house indie games.
Even if that means beating up or killing the women they're meant to love or care about.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
One of the really insidious things about systemic and institutional sexism is that most often regressive attitudes and harmful gender stereotypes are maintained and perpetuated unintentionally.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
And how are you combating systemic sexism? Because last time I checked, we don't live in a world where we're being forced to do anything that we don't want to. In fact, kind of ironically enough, the societies that do have systemic sexism and harmful stereotypes are countries that have very little to no access to video games, like the countries that you're forced to wear the burqa and that they're having limbs chopped off just because they're being exposed, and countries that you're killed if you're raped or sexually assaulted. And I'm supposing that Anita Sarkeesian is saying, oh, that's a bigger picture. Anita Sarkeesian's whole point is that she looks at really small things that are so unimportant to society, you could simply cut them out tomorrow and it wouldn't matter to you in the grand scheme of things.
Likewise, engaging with these games is not going to magically transform players into raging sexists.
Congratulations, Anita Sarkeesian! You've managed to undermine your entire argument. I would rather have you saying playing these games will turn you into a sexist and make you violent and make you psychotic and evil.
We typically don't have a monkey see, monkey do direct cause and effect relationship with the media we consume. Cultural influence works in much more subtle and complicated ways. However, media narratives do have a powerful cultivation effect, helping to shape cultural attitudes and opinions. So when developers exploit sensationalized images of brutalized, mutilated, and victimized women over and over and over again, it tends to reinforce the dominant gender paradigm, which casts men as aggressive and commanding, and frames women as subordinate and dependent.
I see reading Andrea Dawkins has rubbed off on you. But anyway, what about images that show women being dominant and overpowering and men being weak and submissive? And I know those images do exist. We live in a capitalist society where everybody can get their fair share or look at images that they want to look at.
Although these stories use female trauma as the catalyst to set the plot elements in motion, these are not stories about women. Nor are they concerned with the struggles of women navigating the mental, emotional, and physical ramifications of violence. Instead, these are strictly male-centered stories, in which, more often than not, the tragic damsels are just empty shells, whose deaths are depicted as far more meaningful than their lives.
That's the whole point, and in fact, I'm actually shocked she hasn't mentioned Ares, or the boss's death from Metal Gear Solid, or even the Silent Hill series, because those actually are very good depictions of life and death, because like a wise person once said, life and death comes and goes like marionettes dancing on a table. Once they're cut, they easily collapse.
Generally, they're completely defined by their purity, innocence, kindness, beauty, or sensuality. In short, they're just symbols meant to invoke the essence of an artificial feminine ideal.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
In fact, these games usually frame the loss of the woman as something that has been unjustly taken from the male hero.
So now, I take from you.
Jackie, this is not your fault.
The implication being that she belonged to him, that she was his possession.
Nobody belongs to anybody in this society. At best, it's a loving relationship, that they care for each other and they're willing to defend each other, or him from her or her from him, or whatever paradigm you want to choose.
Once wronged, the hero must go get his possessions back, or at least exact a heavy price for their loss. On the surface, victimized women are framed as the reason for the hero's torment. But if we dig a little deeper into the subtext, I'd argue that the true source of the pain stems from feelings of weakness and or guilt over his failure to perform his socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children.
Fuck you! What's patronizing or misogynistic or woman-hating about wanting to protect your children, your offspring, the people that you love? In fact, I would consider it to be a very dysfunctional relationship if you didn't try and protect your kids or children or your wife and girlfriend.
And I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl.
In this way, these failed hero stories are really about the perceived loss of masculinity and then the quest to regain that masculinity, primarily by exerting dominance and control through the performance of violence on others.
Well, that's your interpretation. I just consider emotional engagement with certain level of medium. You can also have engagement through sexuality, or engagement through comedy, or engagement through intelligence. You know, these are trying to engage in certain mediums. You just don't like it because it's not performing to your political ideology.
Consequently, violent revenge-based narratives repeated ad nauseum can also be harmful to men because they help to further limit the possible responses men are allowed to have when faced with death or tragedy. This is
well, depending on the death or tragedy, because I will respond to different situations differently. If somebody wronged me, I'll try to right the wrong, or get at least, like she says, they can pay for it.
Fortunate because interactive media has the potential to be a brilliant medium for people of all genders to explore difficult or painful subjects. So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. Death touches all of our lives eventually, and as such, it's often an integral part of dramatic storytelling.
So what have you been saying? You're saying that women can't die. That's what you normally say. You say women shouldn't die this way, they shouldn't die that way, they shouldn't be brutalized, they shouldn't be this. Oh, go fuck yourself. That's my argument. Why don't you just go and make your own video games or build your own narratives? You claim to be such an expert on it.
To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd.
That's what you're probably heavily implying, that women shouldn't be portrayed in this fashion.
But it's important to consider the ways that women's deaths are framed and examine how and why they're written. There are some games that try to explore loss, death, and grief in more genuine or authentic ways that do not sensationalize or exploit victimized women. Dear Esther, Passage, and To the Moon are a few indie games that investigate these themes in creative, innovative, and sometimes beautiful ways. These more contemplative style games are a hopeful sign, but they're still largely the exception to the rule. A sizable chunk of the industry is still unfortunately trapped in the established pattern of building game narratives on the backs of brutalized female bodies. Violence against women is a serious global epidemic.
You know what? Domestic violence across most of the Western world is actually down, despite population increase. The only countries that seem to have either an increase or no decrease whatsoever are countries that don't have access to video games, that don't have regular access to the internet, which don't have half the things that you usually complain about on the internet, and that you have no interest in helping them in any way, shape or form. Because if you had any interest in helping them, you wouldn't be posting videos. You'd probably be going out there, putting your life on the line, trying to physically help people.
Therefore, attempts to address the issue in fictional contexts demands a considerable degree of respect, subtlety, and nuance.
No, they don't. All they need is the artist to stand by what they're saying or what they need to do. And the best way would be either to lead by example, which you have no intention of doing, or simply just getting out their way and letting them do their fucking job.
Women shouldn't be mere disposable objects or symbolic pawns in stories about men and their own struggles with patriarchal expectations and inadequacies.
You can take the nation of the patriarchy and you can shove it up your ass.
The dark and edgy trope cocktails that we've discussed in this episode are not isolated incidents or obscure anomalies. Instead, they represent an ongoing, recurring pattern in modern gaming narratives. In most cases, the Damsel characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead, which is obviously not a huge improvement from her perspective. I know this episode has been a little bit grim, but please join me next time for the third and final installment covering the Damsel in Distress, where we'll take a look at some titles that attempt to flip the script on the damsel, and then we'll go on a quest to find examples of the elusive dude in distress role reversal.
Ania Sarkeesian, this video was morally disgusting to me on several levels. Ania Sarkeesian, if you're watching this, you should feel ashamed of yourself taking advantage of domestic violence for your own selfish desires.